She handed me an eviction notice at 9 p.m. in the rain. My own daughter. The same girl I rocked through fevers, drove to every piano recital, held when her first boyfriend broke her heart. She slid a legal document across the kitchen table like I was a stranger who'd overstayed a lease. "You have 72 hours, Mom." 72 hours. To leave the house I'd kept alive for 20 years. 3 days later, she was at my door, soaked, shaking, with nothing left. If you want to know what happened in between, stay with me. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. And if it hits you somewhere real, hit that like button. This is my story. All of it. I want to tell you something about the week before everything fell apart. Because it matters. It matters in the way that small, ordinary moments always matter right before they get ripped away from you. It was a Tuesday. I remember because I had just finished reorganizing the linen closet on the second floor of the Ashford estate, something I did every third week without being asked, because that's the kind of woman I am. The kind who notices when the hand towels are fraying at the edges, the kind who replaces them before anyone has to say a word. I had worked for the Ashford family for nearly 11 years. Household manager, they called me, which is a polished way of saying I was the person who held that enormous drafty manor together with my bare hands and 40 years of practical knowledge. I managed the staff, the vendors, the seasonal maintenance contracts, the guest arrangements, the kitchens, the gardens when the head groundskeeper was sick. I knew which pipes groaned in February and which windows needed recalking before hurricane season. I knew where old Mr. Ashford kept his private scotch, and why he preferred the blue teacup over the white one, even though they were identical to everyone else. I was good at my job, quietly, consistently, invisibly good. And I did it all while also being a widow, while raising Brielle alone, while managing a grief I never gave myself permission to put down. My husband, Danny, had died 6 years before all of this. A heart attack that nobody saw coming, including Danny himself. He was 51, healthy enough. He went to work one morning and didn't come home. And I spent the years after that learning how to be two people at once, a mother and a father, a provider and a comforter, while making sure Brielle never saw how close to the edge I sometimes stood. She was 26 by the time this story begins. 26, beautiful, restless, and hungry for a life bigger than the one we had. I understood that hunger. I'd had it once myself. But there's a difference between ambition and entitlement, and somewhere along the way, I'm still not entirely sure when, Brielle had crossed that line without either of us noticing. Or maybe I noticed. Maybe I just told myself it was a phase. That Tuesday, I got home from the Ashford estate at 6:30. Our house, the one Danny and I had bought together 23 years ago on a street lined with oak trees that had since grown enormous and generous, was quiet in the way it always was when Brielle wasn't home. I liked that quiet. It was mine. I'd earned it. I was heating up leftover soup when my phone rang. Unfamiliar number. Local area code. "Mrs. Vance?" The voice was formal, careful, the voice of someone who delivers complicated news for a living. "My name is Gerald Hutchins. I'm the senior executor for the Vance Alderman Investment Trust. I believe we have some important information to discuss regarding your late husband, Daniel Vance." I turned off the stove. I sat down. I will spare you the full hour of that phone call because even now, reconstructing it makes my chest feel strange. What Gerald Hutchins explained to me, piece by careful piece, was this. 19 years before he died, Danny had quietly invested a portion of an inheritance from his uncle. Money I barely knew existed, money Danny had always been private about, into a blind investment trust. He'd done it through a small firm, signed documentation that included a beneficiary clause, and then, as Danny was prone to doing with anything that made him anxious, he had tucked it away in the back of his mind and rarely spoken of it again. The trust had grown. Significantly. $33 million. $33 million, sitting quietly in a trust for 19 years while I worked myself to the bone managing someone else's estate, while I raised our daughter on a single income, while I clipped grocery coupons and told myself we were fine. I pressed my hand flat on the kitchen table to make sure it was still solid. The primary beneficiary, Gerald said, as named in the original documentation, is your daughter, Brielle Ann Vance. Not me. Brielle. There are conditions attached, Gerald continued, and I heard the slight hesitation in his voice, the professional care. The trust includes a morality clause, a family protection clause, and a final review period. I'd recommend we schedule a meeting to go over those in detail before any transfers are processed. Yes, I said. Of course. I hung up and sat in my kitchen for a long time. My first thought, I'm being honest with you here, was not about the money. It was about Danny. About what it meant that he had done this secretly, carefully, with the kind of long-game thinking I had always loved about him. Even from wherever he was now, he was still trying to take care of us. My second thought was about Brielle, and something in my stomach tightened. I called her that night. She answered on the third ring, slightly breathless, background noise suggesting a restaurant or a bar. She was living in an apartment across town, had been for 2 years, and we spoke 2 or 3 times a week with the kind of warmth that had slowly, over the last year or so, developed a surface underneath it, like a frozen lake that looks solid but has gone soft in places you can't see. Mom, what's up? I'm kind of in the middle of something. I got a call today, I said, about your father's estate, something we didn't know about. A pause. The background noise dimmed slightly. What do you mean? There was a trust, Brielle, an investment your dad set up years ago. I hesitated, then said it plainly. You're going to receive a significant inheritance. Another pause. Longer. How significant? I told her. The silence that followed was different from any silence I'd heard from my daughter before. It was the silence of a person trying to rearrange their entire sense of reality in real time. $33 million, she repeated. Not a question, just the words moving through her like a current. There are conditions, I started. Mom. Her voice had changed. It was brighter, electric, like a light turning on in a room that had been dark for years. Mom, do you know what this means? It means we need to sit down with the executor and understand it means everything changes. She laughed, and the laugh was genuine, and I loved her so much in that moment that I pushed the tightness in my stomach down and told myself I was being paranoid. I have to go. I have to tell Calder. Mom, I love you. I'll call you tomorrow. She hung up. I should tell you about Calder Wynn. Calder. I should have told you about Calder Wynn from the very beginning, actually, because Calder is really where this story starts. Or where the dark part of it starts, anyway. Brielle had been with Calder for 8 months when the call from Gerald Hutchins came. 8 months is not a long time. Not long enough to truly know a person, especially a person who is skilled at being whatever the room needs him to be. Calder was 34, attractive in a groomed, deliberate way, and he had the smooth conversational ease of someone who had spent years learning how to make people feel seen without actually seeing them. The first time I met him, at a dinner Brielle hosted in her apartment, he complimented my soup twice and asked careful, attentive questions about my work at the Ashford estate. He was charming, warm, even. I drove home that night with a knot between my shoulder blades that I couldn't explain. Some people put you at ease, and some people make you perform ease, make you perform comfort and warmth and openness, while something underneath you stays very, very still. Calder made me perform. I never told Brielle that. I told myself it was just the protective suspicion of a mother who had raised her daughter alone, who had a hard time sharing her. I told myself I was being unfair. I spent a lot of that year telling myself I was being unfair. Brielle didn't call the next morning. She showed up at the house 2 days later with Calder beside her and a woman I didn't recognize. A woman in a charcoal blazer carrying a leather portfolio who turned out to be a real estate attorney. Not the estate's attorney, not Gerald Hutchins. A different attorney altogether. I had just finished my morning coffee. I was still in my robe. Brielle? I held the door open, confused, looking between her and Calder and the woman I hadn't been introduced to. What is this? Brielle stepped inside first. She was dressed in a way I hadn't seen before, not dramatically different, but different in the details. New coat, hair blown out, the posture of someone who had decided something. Mom, we need to talk. Calder followed her in without being invited. He was carrying himself differently, too. Less warm, less performative, more settled, like a man who had been waiting to stop pretending. The attorney, she introduced herself as Diane Moss, sat at my kitchen table with her portfolio and began speaking about property assessments and legal tenancy questions before I had fully processed the fact that all three of them had arrived at my home together without warning with a lawyer. "I'm sorry," I said, cutting Diane off mid-sentence. "Brielle, what is happening right now?" My daughter looked at me across the kitchen table, and I saw something in her eyes that I didn't recognize. Not cruelty, exactly. Something more confused than cruel. Something that had been talked into a position and was now working hard to hold it. "Calder and I have been talking," she said, "about the inheritance, about what makes sense." "Okay." I kept my voice steady. "And?" "The house is in Dad's name, which means it's technically part of the estate." She glanced at Diane, who gave a small confirming nod. "We want to have it assessed." "Assessed," I repeated. "It's a significant asset, and it's—" She paused. Calder touched her arm. Brief, light, the kind of touch that looks supportive and functions as a signal. "It should be part of what I take ownership of, as the primary beneficiary." The room was very quiet. I looked at my daughter. I looked at the man beside her, who was looking at a point somewhere over my left shoulder. I looked at the attorney writing something in her portfolio. I said very carefully, "Brielle, I have lived in this house for 23 years. Your father and I bought this house together. You grew up in this house." "I know that, Mom." "Then what exactly are you suggesting?" Another glance at Calder, another small arm touch. "We're suggesting," Calder said, speaking for the first time since he'd entered my home, "that it might make more sense for Brielle to have full legal control of all estate-related assets during the transition period. For clarity, for efficiency." I looked at him. He held my gaze with the steady, practiced calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment. "For clarity," I said. "Yes. And efficiency." "That's right." I turned back to my daughter. "Brielle, I want to hear this from you, not from him. From you." She swallowed. For just a moment, just a flicker, I saw the girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. She was in there somewhere, behind the new coat and the lawyer and the man with the practiced calm. But then she straightened. "You should probably start looking for another place to stay, Mom, while we sort everything out." I'd like to tell you that I argued, that I stood up from that table and told all three of them exactly what I thought, in terms that would have peeled the paint from the walls. But that's not what I did. I got up, walked to the kitchen counter, poured myself a second cup of coffee I didn't want, and stood with my back to all of them for a long moment. Then I turned around and said, very quietly, "I'd like you all to leave my home now." "Mrs. Vance," Diane began, "this is still my home today, and today I'm asking you to leave." Calder opened his mouth. I looked at him. Whatever he saw on my face made him close it again. Brielle stood up slowly. She didn't look at me as she gathered her coat. At the door she paused. "Mom, this isn't personal, it's just, go," I said. She went. I stood in my kitchen for a very long time after that. The coffee went cold. The oak trees outside the window moved in a wind I couldn't hear. I stood there and I thought about Danny, about what he would have said, what he would have done. And then I thought about what he had actually done. The trust, the conditions, the morality clause and the family protection clause that Gerald Hutchins had mentioned on the phone. Danny had known something, or suspected something, or simply understood in that quiet, long-game way of his that money changes people, that it changes them fast. He had built guardrails. I just didn't know yet how strong they were. The eviction notice arrived 4 days later. I'm not using that word loosely. It was an actual eviction notice, printed on legal letterhead, signed by Diane Moss on behalf of Brielle Ann Vance, giving me 72 hours to vacate the property at 14 Orchard Hill Road, the house where I had lived for 23 years. The house where Brielle had taken her first steps, The house where Danny had died, quietly, in his sleep, in the bedroom upstairs. Brielle hand-delivered it herself. She came alone that time, which surprised me. No Calder, no attorney. Just my daughter, standing in the rain on the porch she'd grown up running across, holding a manila envelope. I opened the door before she could knock. We looked at each other. She held out the envelope. I took it, opened it, read it slowly, all the way through, while she stood there in the rain with water dripping from the ends of her hair. When I finished, I folded it back along its creases. 72 hours, I said. The lawyer said, I heard you the other night, Brielle. I understand what's happening. I looked at her, really looked, the way you look at a person you are trying to memorize. I just want to ask you one thing. She waited. Is this what you want? Not what Calder wants. Not what the lawyers say makes sense. What you want. Do you want me to leave this house? Something moved across her face. Something I would have called doubt in another context. But then her jaw set. Yes, she said. It's the right thing, financially. I nodded slowly. Okay, I said. I'll be out in 3 days. I started to close the door. Mom, I'm going to say one thing to you, and I need you to hear it. I held the door half closed and looked at my daughter through the rain. Money doesn't make you safe. People do. You remember that. She opened her mouth. I closed the door. Tom, I packed for 3 days, but it didn't take me 3 days. It took me one afternoon because it turned out that after 23 years in a home, the things that truly belong to you, the things that are irreplaceably yours, fit into far less space than you imagine. One large suitcase, a box of photographs, Danny's old jacket that still smelled faintly like him if I pressed my face into the collar and held my breath, a small box of documents, tax records, old letters, a file folder of Danny's papers I had never fully sorted through because sorting through them meant accepting that sorting them was something I would do alone, and a key. An old brass key on a plain steel ring that I found in the back of Danny's desk drawer. I didn't know what it opened. I had found it years ago and set it aside and forgotten about it. The way you forget about things you don't understand and don't have the bandwidth to investigate. I pocketed it on instinct. I don't know why. Some things you do without knowing why, and the reason only becomes clear later. I loaded my car in the rain on a Thursday evening with the oak trees dripping and the street empty and the lights in my house glowing warmly through the windows. Windows I had cleaned 100 times, rooms I had kept alive with my own hands for more than 2 decades. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment with the engine running. I didn't cry, not then. The crying would come later, in private, in the dark. The way it always does when you are a woman who learned a long time ago that the moments when you most need to fall apart are usually the moments when you absolutely cannot afford to. I put the car in drive, and as I pulled away from 14 Orchard Hill Road for the last time as its resident, I said out loud to no one, to Danny, to the house itself, I'll figure it out. That part, at least, I was right about. The place Danny used to talk about was called Vance's Stop, a roadside diner he and his brother had inherited from their father, a squat, practical building set back from Route 9, with a gravel lot and a hand-painted sign that had faded to almost nothing over the years. His brother had moved away 2 decades ago and signed his half over to Danny in a handshake agreement that was never properly formalized, which meant the property had technically passed to me when Danny died, buried in the tangle of estate paperwork I had never fully unraveled, because grief is a remarkable thing for making administrative tasks feel impossible. It had been closed for 4 years, maybe 5. I drove out to it the evening I left Orchard Hill Road, not because I had a plan, but because it was the only property I could think of that was mine in a way no lawyer could dispute in the next 72 hours. I pulled into the gravel lot in the dark and sat in the car with the headlights off. It was worse than I remembered. The sign had come down on one side and was hanging at an angle. 2 of the front windows were boarded. The parking lot had cracked and heaved from a few winters of freeze and thaw, and weeds had come up through the asphalt in long, assertive lines. The diner itself was a 1950s-era structure, that particular American shape, low and rectangular with a curved roof edge and big window frames, and even in disrepair it had a certain stubbornness to it, like it had decided to outlast everyone who ever doubted it. I understood that feeling. I found the spare key under the flat rock near the back entrance where Danny had always kept it, which said a lot about how little anyone had bothered with this place since he died. The lock was stiff, but it turned. The back door swung open into a darkness that smelled like old grease and dust, and underneath both of those, something faintly familiar. The specific interior smell of a building that had been cared for once and was waiting, with the patience of old structures, to be cared for again. I found the circuit breaker by flashlight. Half the lights worked. The ones that did cast a pale yellow glow across the diner's interior. The long formica counter, the row of round stools with their cracked vinyl seats, the booths along the window wall, the kitchen visible through the pass-through. Everything was coated in a fine gray dust. A coffee mug sat upside down in the dish rack like someone had just washed it and stepped out for a moment and simply never come back. I sat down in the last booth. The vinyl squeaked under me. I put my suitcase on the seat across and rested my forehead in my hands and sat like that for a while. I was 58 years old. I had worked my entire adult life. I had raised a daughter alone. I had kept another family's estate running for 11 years with the kind of invisible competence that people only notice when it stops. And I had just been evicted from my own home by my only child, who was being steered by a man I had distrusted from the first time I shook his hand. I let myself feel all of that, fully. In that dusty, half-lit booth, I let it move through me the way a bad storm moves through. Not pleasant, not brief, but at least honest. Then I got up, found a broom in the back closet, and started sweeping, because that is what I do. It's not a virtue particularly, it's just what I do when everything else falls away. I find the thing that needs doing, and I do it. Keys. The first night in the diner was the hardest. I slept in the back office on a cot I found folded against the wall. Danny must have used it during late inventory nights, years ago. The cot was narrow and the room smelled stale, and at around 3 in the morning I woke up and genuinely did not, for about 30 seconds, know where I was. Then I did know, and that was worse. I lay there in the dark and listened to the silence of Route 9 at 3 a.m., which isn't actually silence at all, but a specific loneliness made of distant truck engines and wind and the particular creak of an old building talking to itself. And I thought about Brielle. Not with anger, right then. The anger was there, but underneath it was something heavier. Grief, maybe. The grief of watching a person you love walk toward something dangerous and being unable to stop them because they have mistaken your warning for control. I had made mistakes with Brielle. I knew that. I was not the perfect mother in this story. I want to be clear about that because I am not interested in pretending otherwise. I had worked too much. I had been too proud to ask for help in the years after Danny died, and that pride had made me distant in moments when she needed closeness. There were conversations we should have had that we never had because I was too tired or she was too guarded or both of us were too used to leaving the hard things in the unspoken space between us. But there is a distance between imperfect and what she had done, between complicated and an eviction notice, between the mistakes a parent makes and the decision to hand a stranger the keys to your family's future. I knew Calder was behind it. I felt it in my bones the way you feel a coming cold front, that drop in atmospheric pressure before the weather turns. But feeling something and proving it are different countries entirely, and I had nothing but instinct and a knot between my shoulder blades. I got up at 5:30. Made instant coffee on the small burner I found in the back. Stood at the boarded window in the dark, watching the early light start to pale the edge of the sky, and told myself, one day at a time, find out what you know. Find out what you don't. Start there. It was in that spirit that I opened the box of Danny's papers. But I had brought it almost by accident. It was in the stack of things I'd gathered from the office before I left. The file folder I'd always meant to properly sort through, and never had. Old documents, mostly. Insurance papers. Some correspondence. A few folders I'd never opened because they were labeled in Danny's handwriting, and opening them had always felt, in the years after he died, like opening a wound. I spread everything across the diner counter in the yellow light and began going through it systematically. Insurance policies, old car registrations, tax returns from the mid-2000s, a folder of receipts for home repairs. And then, In a manila envelope at the bottom of the box, sealed but not labeled, I found something else. A letter. Handwritten. Danny's handwriting. Not a letter to me, or not directly. It was addressed to Gerald Hutchins, the executor, dated 14 months before Danny died. Reading it felt like hearing his voice come out of the silence of that diner office, and for a moment I had to put it down and breathe. When I picked it up again and read it all the way through, I understood two things I hadn't understood before. The first was that Danny had been more worried about Brielle's future than he had ever told me. Not worried about her survival, worried about her choices. Specifically, worried about her susceptibility to people who would use her hunger for a bigger life against her. He had written, in his careful, deliberate way, "She has my restlessness and her mother's heart, and those two things together are a gift, but they can be exploited by the wrong person. I want there to be a structure in place that she cannot simply dismantle in a moment of poor judgment, because all of us have those moments, and most of us cannot afford for them to cost $33 million. He had known. Not specifically, he couldn't have known about Calder Wynn, who didn't exist in our lives then. But he had known the shape of the danger in the way that parents sometimes know things about their children that even the children don't know about themselves. The second thing I understood was the morality clause. Danny's letter outlined it in plain language. The trust was structured so that the inheritance could be frozen, partially or entirely, if the primary beneficiary took certain actions that the executor determined violated the spirit of the trust's intent. Specifically, actions that demonstrated financial recklessness, exploitation of other family members, or the unauthorized transfer of estate assets. There was also a 60-day review period built in from the date of the initial notification, during which the executor had the right to observe and investigate before releasing any significant funds. Brielle had been notified about the inheritance. The 60-day clock was running. I read the letter 3 times. Then I sat back on the diner stool and let out a long, slow breath. Danny, I thought, you impossible, brilliant man. He had built a trap, not a cruel one, a protective one, a structure designed to catch recklessness before it became catastrophe. He'd trusted Gerald Hutchins, someone he'd worked with for years, to be the gatekeeper. And he had done all of it quietly, without telling me, because he knew if he told me I would have argued that Brielle didn't need to be managed that way. I would have defended her. I was wrong. He was right. That's a hard thing to hold. The idea that someone who loved you saw a danger more clearly than you did. But I held it. Because the alternative was to keep arguing with the truth. And the truth was sitting in a manila envelope in a closed diner at 6 in the morning, and it didn't care whether I was comfortable with it. I carefully refolded Danny's letter and put it back in the envelope. Then I picked up my phone and called Gerald Hutchins' office number, knowing I'd get voicemail at this hour, and left a message asking him to call me as soon as possible regarding what I believed to be a significant violation of the trust terms. Then I made a second cup of coffee, and I started thinking about what came next. Gerald called back at 8:15, which was faster than I expected. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "I was hoping to hear from you, actually. Are you somewhere you can speak privately? I'm at a diner on Route 9. There's no one else here." "Good." A pause. Papers rustling. "I need to tell you something that I should have made clearer in our initial call, and I apologize for not doing so. Your daughter has been in contact with my office, with her own attorney, not through me. They've been making inquiries about accelerating the transfer of funds." I set down my coffee cup. "How far have they gotten?" "They haven't gotten anywhere. The 60-day review period is legally binding and cannot be waived by the beneficiary, but the inquiries themselves are notable, particularly given some of the language her attorney has been using." He cleared his throat. "Mrs. Vance, your husband's instructions were very specific about what constitutes a violation of the trust conditions. The eviction of a dependent family member, and I want to be precise here. The house is technically considered part of the estate's holdings until the review period closes. Potentially qualifies." "Potentially," I repeated. "The determination is mine to make, and I want to make it carefully, but I need documentation. If there are actions being taken that you believe violate the trust's intent, I need to know about them in detail, with whatever evidence you can provide." "I have a letter," I said. Danny's letter to you, his handwriting, outlining his exact intentions. A silence. I have my copy, but a second copy in your possession adds weight. Another pause. Mrs. Vance, I want you to understand my position. I take the responsibilities of this role very seriously. Your husband trusted me with this. I don't intend to fail that trust, but I need you to be patient, and I need you to document everything. I can do that, I said. And Mrs. Vance? He hesitated. Be careful. I don't know the full picture of what's happening with your daughter's situation, but the speed of the inquiries her attorney has been making suggests someone with experience in moving fast before guardrails can be applied. The knot between my shoulder blades tightened. Calder Wynn, I said. I don't have that name in front of me, but if there's a third party influencing your daughter's decisions, that is extremely relevant information. I'll find out what I can, I said. We hung up. I sat in the diner for a moment, the morning light coming pale and flat through the gaps in the boarded windows. Then I called the one person I should have called days earlier. Her name was Patrice Odom, and she had been my closest friend for 17 years. She had worked at the Ashford estate with me in the early years. She was the head housekeeper, and I was the household manager, and we had formed the kind of friendship that you can only form with someone who has seen you at the particular unglamorous exhaustion of physical work. She had moved on from the Ashford estate 5 years ago to manage a property on the other side of the county, but we still talked every week, and she was, without question, the sharpest and most practically intelligent person I knew. She answered on the first ring. I've been waiting for you to call, she said, which was the most Patrice thing she could have possibly said. She evicted me. I know, somebody who works at the salon near your old house called her cousin who's friends with my neighbor. Marla, this town is the size of a postage stamp. You know that. A brief silence. Where are you? Danny's Diner. The one on Route 9? Yes. A pause. Okay, I'll be there in 40 minutes. Don't touch anything in that kitchen before I get there, because knowing you, you've already started planning to rewire the electrical panel, and I need to assess the situation first. I almost laughed. It was the first thing close to a laugh I'd managed in days. I found something, I said, in Danny's papers. Tell me when I get there. Patrice arrived in 38 minutes with 2 thermoses of real coffee, a bag of groceries, and the focused, practical energy of a woman who treats every crisis as a project management problem. She walked in, looked around the diner slowly and carefully, then looked at me. You look terrible, she said. Thank you. Have you slept? On a cot in the back office. A cot. She said it the way you say something you need to process. A cot, while your daughter is sleeping in your house. I'd rather not. I'm not saying it to twist the knife. I'm saying it because you need to get angry, Marla. You need to stop being calm and sad and start being clear-eyed and strategic, because calm and sad is not going to get you through this. Clear-eyed and strategic is. She set the groceries on the counter. Now, tell me about what you found. I told her everything. Danny's letter, the morality clause, the 60-day review, Gerald Hutchins, and what he'd said about the speed of the inquiries Brielle's attorney was making. Patrice listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her, which meant she was taking it seriously. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. This Calder, she said. What do you know about him? Not enough. He's smooth, too smooth. He knew how to read a room from the first minute I met him. Where's he from? Brielle said he was from somewhere in the Pacific Northwest originally. Moved here about 2 years ago. He told her he was in private wealth management. Patrice's expression shifted in a way I couldn't fully read. Private wealth management. Yes. And in the 8 months he's been with Brielle before the inheritance, what was he actually doing for money? Did you ever find out? I opened my mouth, closed it. She said he had clients. She never gave specifics, and I didn't push hard enough. You didn't push because she would have accused you of not trusting her judgment. Patrice pointed at me without accusation. And she would have been partly right, because you don't trust his judgment, and she can't separate those two things yet. Classic. Patrice, I'm not criticizing you, Marla. I'm mapping the terrain. She picked up her coffee thermos. A man who appears in a woman's life establishes a relationship over 8 months, and then, the moment she comes into a significant amount of money, begins moving very fast toward legal control of that money. That is a pattern. That is a documented, recognizable pattern that has a name. The back of my neck went cold. You think he knew, before the inheritance? I think we need to find out. How much did Brielle know about the trust before Gerald's call? Nothing. Neither of us knew. It was completely... I stopped. Danny was private about that money. He barely talked about his uncle's inheritance, but the investment firm, he did use a local firm, small one. If Calder had connections in the financial sector locally, if he'd done any research into local estates with pending disbursements, it's not as hard to find as people think, Patrice said quietly. Trust filings are public record in most states. If you know what to look for, and you have the right contacts. We looked at each other across the Formica counter. He targeted her, I said. The words felt strange in my mouth, like they didn't quite fit the shape of reality yet. Maybe. Or maybe he got lucky and moved fast when luck arrived. Either way, the result is the same. Patrice set down her thermos. What do you need, Marla? Right now, practically. What do you need? I need to know what he's already done. What he's gotten Brielle to sign, what he's moved, what he's put in motion. I pressed my hands flat on the counter. And I need to find a way to document it. Then let's start there. What followed over the next several days was not glamorous. I want you to understand that because stories like this one sometimes get told as if the revelation arrives cleanly, like a door opening onto a lit room. It didn't. What actually happened was that Patrice and I sat in a diner with bad lighting and a temperamental internet connection from a hotspot on her phone, and we worked. We found Calder Wynn's name attached to a wealth management firm that had been dissolved in another state, a firm that had faced regulatory complaints 2 years before he came to our town. The complaints were civil, not criminal, and they had been quietly settled, which meant they were difficult to find but not impossible. Not if you knew how to look and you had enough patience to dig through public filings. Patrice knew how to look. She had managed estates for wealthy families for 2 decades. And in that world, you learn very quickly that the financial histories of the people you work with require careful scrutiny because the alternative is ending up as a casualty of someone else's scheme. Look at this, she said on the second evening, turning her laptop screen toward me. The firm was called Wynn & Associates Capital Group. Dissolved 18 months ago. The regulatory complaint cited misleading representations to clients regarding investment risk and expected returns. 3 clients had filed, 2 settled, 1 had gone to arbitration and lost on a technicality. Misleading representations, I said. That's the polished version of, he told them what they wanted to hear and took their money. Patrice closed the laptop. He's done this before, Marla. Maybe not at this scale, but he's done this before. This doesn't help me right now, I said. Brielle is still in that house. He's still with her. The clock is still running. I know. But this is evidence of pattern. And pattern matters when you're trying to convince an executor, or eventually a judge, that a third party deliberately manipulated a beneficiary to undermine the conditions of a trust. I sat back. The diner stool squeaked. Outside the boarded windows, the Route 9 traffic had thinned to almost nothing. It was late. She won't believe me, I said. And I meant it. Not as self-pity, but as a realistic assessment of where we were. Brielle had already made her position clear. She had already chosen. Any approach I made to her directly would look like interference, like a desperate mother trying to reclaim control. Calder would make sure of that. She doesn't have to believe you right now, Patrice said. She just has to run out of road. And if she signs something before she does? Patrice met my eyes. That's why we need to move faster than Calder is moving. Not louder, faster. I thought of Gerald Hutchins, of the 60-day review, of the morality clause Danny had built so carefully into a document he'd never shown me, in a trust I hadn't known existed because he had understood something about protection that I was only now catching up to. I thought of the brass key in my jacket pocket, the one from Danny's desk drawer, the one I still didn't know the purpose of. I took it out and set it on the counter between us. I don't know what this opens, I said. I just know Danny kept it, and Danny didn't keep things without a reason. Patrice looked at the key for a long moment. Then we find out what it opens, she said. I picked the key back up and held it in my palm. It was warm from my pocket. Old. The kind of key that belongs to something substantial. Not a safety deposit box. Not a luggage lock. Something solid. Something meant to stay locked for a long time, until the person with the right key showed up. Danny had kept it. Danny had reasons for everything he kept. I closed my fingers around it. Somewhere in the town behind me, my daughter was sleeping in a house she had taken from me, next to a man who I was becoming increasingly certain she did not truly know. The money was there, enormous and waiting, and the 60-day clock was turning with the slow certainty of a tide. But so was I. The key opened a storage unit. I didn't figure that out right away. It took 3 more days. 3 days of Patrice and me working in the diner, cross-referencing whatever we could find on Calder Win, while I quietly fell apart and put myself back together on a rotating schedule, before I thought to go through the rest of Danny's papers carefully enough to find a folded receipt tucked into the inner pocket of the file folder. A receipt from a place called Clearwater Self-Storage on the eastern edge of town, dated 11 years ago, with a unit number handwritten in the corner in Danny's careful print. Unit 14. I drove out there on a Wednesday morning with the brass key in my hand and a feeling in my chest that I can only describe as bracing. The way you feel before you open something you've been afraid to open. Not because you expect it to be terrible, but because you understand it's going to be significant. The storage facility was one of those anonymous orange and gray operations off a frontage road, the kind of place that looks the same in every town across America. The unit was in the second row, ground level. The lock was stiff from years of disuse, and the key resisted for a moment before it turned. The door rolled up with a sound like a long exhale. Inside, in the pale fluorescent wash from the facility's overhead lights, was a metal shelving unit holding 7 labeled archive boxes, a locked fireproof cabinet, and a wooden crate I immediately recognized as the one Danny had brought home from his father's house after the old man died, which I had assumed was full of outdated financial records and eventually donated to the local transfer station. It had never gone to the transfer station. I stood in the doorway of that storage unit for a long moment, my hand still on the roll door, and I thought about my husband, about the quiet, layered way he moved through the world, always building structures that others wouldn't see until they needed them. He had been like that in life too. He didn't explain himself much. He just arranged things carefully and waited for the arrangement to matter. I pulled the first archive box off the shelf and opened it right there in the doorway. Inside were documents, neatly organized with labeled dividers, the original trust paperwork, correspondence with Gerald Hutchins spanning more than a decade, account statements for the investment fund showing its growth in 5-year increments. Danny had been monitoring it. He hadn't said it and forgotten it. He'd watched it grow every year, every 5 years, tracked it, updated the beneficiary documentation twice. He knew exactly what it was worth. He knew. And he kept it separate from our daily life, from our struggles, from the mortgage stress and the grocery budgets, and the years when I thought about going back to school and decided I couldn't afford to. He kept it separate, locked away in a storage unit with an unmarked key because he was afraid. Not of me. I understood that immediately, and I want to make that clear. He wasn't hiding it from me out of secrecy or distrust. He was hiding it from circumstance, from the possibility that if we knew it was there, we'd spend it, or someone would find out and try to take it, or it would change the daily arithmetic of our lives in ways that would make us complacent, careless. Danny had grown up watching his father lose money to exactly that kind of complacency, and it had shaped him in ways he couldn't always articulate but always acted on. He was protecting it, for Brielle, for after. But then I opened the wooden crate. And that's where this story shifted on its axis in a way I hadn't anticipated. The crate contained, among other things, a portable hard drive in a sealed plastic bag and a notebook, the kind with a black cardboard cover, 100 pages, Danny's handwriting filling it from front to back. A research notebook. Methodical. Dated entries spanning almost 2 years before he died. The first entry was dated March, almost 8 years ago. It was brief. It read, "Received a call today from a man named Raymond Wynn, inquiring about investment opportunities in the trust. Said he was referred by a mutual contact. Name didn't check out. Declined to engage further. Making note here in case pattern continues. My hands went very still. I turned the pages carefully. The entries continued. Not daily, not even weekly, but consistently enough to form a record. A man named Raymond Wynn had contacted Danny twice more over the following year. The second time, he'd identified himself as a financial consultant. The third time, Danny had done enough research to determine that Raymond Wynn had a son named Calder, who at that time would have been in his mid-20s, apparently working in the same loosely defined private wealth sector as his father. Danny had written, "I don't know what they want specifically. I suspect they have information about the trust, impossible to know how, and are positioning to access it through family channels. I am documenting this in the event it becomes relevant." It had become relevant. I sat down on the concrete floor of that storage unit with the notebook in my lap, and I stayed there for a long time. Calder Wynn had not stumbled into Brielle's life by accident. His father had been circling our family for years before Danny died. Whether Calder had deliberately continued what Raymond started, or whether he'd grown up in a household where the Vance family trust was discussed as a target, I didn't know yet. But the connection was documented, dated, and written in Danny's own hand. I called Patrice. "Get to the diner," I said. "I found something. I found everything." Patrice arrived 40 minutes after I did, still wearing her work clothes, and she read through Danny's notebook standing at the diner counter without sitting down. She didn't say anything until she reached the last entry, which was dated 2 months before Danny's heart attack. It read, "I've updated the trust conditions again with Gerald. If anything happens to me, I want the executor to know that the names Raymond Wynn and Calder Wynn should be flagged as potential risks to the beneficiary. I have not shared this with Marla. She would worry, and there is nothing to worry about yet. I just want it on record." Patrice set the notebook down. "He wrote to Gerald about this," she said. "Yes." "Does Gerald know that Calder is the same Wynn?" "I don't know. Danny's letter mentioned the names, but not with photographs or proof of connection. If Calder uses a different variation of his name professionally, or if Gerald never connected the dots, you have to call him today." Patrice pushed the notebook back across the counter toward me. "Right now, Marla. Not tomorrow. Today." I was already dialing. Gerald Hutchins picked up on the second ring, which told me he was waiting for my call, or at least expecting it. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "I'm glad you reached out. I've been reviewing the trust documentation again, and I've been meaning to." "I found Danny's storage unit," I said. "Gerald, I have a research notebook. Danny's handwriting, dated entries going back 8 years. He documented contact from a man named Raymond Wynn, Calder Wynn's father." I waited a beat. "Did you know about the Wynn connection?" A long pause. The kind of pause that has weight to it. "Your husband mentioned the name in correspondence," Gerald said slowly. "I flagged it at the time, but without a definitive connection to anyone currently associated with your daughter, I couldn't act on it. I need you to understand, Mrs. Vance, I am constrained in what I can do unilaterally. The trust is a legal document. I cannot freeze it, investigate third parties, or intervene in your daughter's personal relationships without documented cause." "I have documented cause. I have 8 years of documented cause in Danny's handwriting." "Then I need to see it, all of it." Another pause. "Mrs. Vance, I have to tell you something I should have told you sooner. 3 days ago, I received a request from an attorney representing your daughter to waive the 60-day review period and release the first tranche of funds." The diner went very quiet around me. "How much?" I asked. $3,200,000, listed as a preliminary disbursement to cover," he read from something. Quote, "immediate estate management expenses and pre-approved investment commitments." "Investment commitments," I repeated. "Gerald, there are no investment commitments. Brielle doesn't know anything about investment. She's been with this man for 8 months. What investments could she possibly have already committed to?" "I denied the request," Gerald said. "I denied it this morning, which is why I suspect you may receive some unusual activity in the next few days. When these requests are denied, the parties making them typically escalate." I pressed my hand against the counter. "Meaning what, exactly?" "Meaning they may try to go around me, approach the investment house directly, Use whatever they've gotten her to sign to attempt to access the accounts through a different channel. He paused. Mrs. Vance, bring me that notebook. Bring me everything in that storage unit. And bring me anything at all. You can find that documents financial activity Brielle may have authorized without fully understanding, because if Calder Wynn has positioned himself to drain those accounts using forged or coerced documentation, the window in which we can stop him is closing. I was already reaching for my car keys. Punt. I need to tell you about the afternoon I drove to what was still, legally, my daughter's house, or the house that had been mine, because that drive was one of the hardest things I've done in recent memory. Not because I was afraid of a confrontation. I'd moved past afraid by then. I was past a lot of things. What made it hard was the grief of it, driving down that familiar street toward that familiar house with the oak trees and the porch where I'd sat through 100 summer evenings, knowing that I was coming not as a resident or a mother, but as someone trying to catch a man in the act of robbing my child blind. I parked across the street. I sat there for a few minutes. There was a car in the driveway I didn't recognize, a rental from the plates, and another car I recognized as Diane Moss's, the attorney Calder had brought to my kitchen table. That many people in my house on a Wednesday afternoon was not nothing. I called Brielle's cell phone. It rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. I called again. Same result. On the 3rd call, she picked up. Her voice was slightly off. Not upset, not exactly, but the particular tonal flatness of someone who is holding something together with effort. Mom, I can't really... Are you at the house right now? Yes, but we're in the middle of... Is Calder there? A beat. He's here, yes. And Diane, and some people Calder wanted to bring in to discuss. Brielle. I kept my voice completely level. I need you to step away from them for 60 seconds. Just 60 seconds. Go to the kitchen. Close the door. Mom, this isn't a good... 60 seconds, please. A long pause. The sound of movement. A door. Relative quiet. Okay, she said. Her voice was lower now. What? I need you to tell me if you have signed anything. Anything at all in the last week. Documents Diane brought, documents Calder brought, anything. A very long silence. Brielle. There were some preliminary agreements, she said carefully. Investment framework documents. Calder said they were standard procedure for positioning the funds before the 60-day period closes. Investment framework documents. I closed my eyes briefly. What did they say? Did you read them? Yes, I read them. They were about establishing a joint venture vehicle for... She stopped. A shorter silence. Calder explained what they meant. Calder explained them. You didn't have an independent attorney review them. Diane reviewed them. Diane is Calder's attorney, Brielle. She is not your attorney. She does not work for you. I waited. Did you have your own lawyer look at anything you signed? The silence this time was of a different quality. It had a texture to it. The texture of someone beginning to hear something they have been working hard not to hear. They said there wasn't time, she said. The window for the preliminary investment positions closes this week, and if we don't establish the vehicle before... There is no window, Brielle. My voice stayed level, but the words were deliberate, and I laid each one down carefully. The 60-day review period is a legal condition your father built into the trust. Gerald Hutchins denied a disbursement request 3 days ago. If Calder told you there was a time-sensitive window for investments, he's lying. There is nothing time-sensitive except his need to get money transferred before Gerald can stop him. Absolute silence. Brielle, are you there? She stopped. That's not right. He wouldn't... I found your father's storage unit. I watched the house across the street. Nobody had come to the windows. I found his records. A man named Raymond Wynn contacted your father years ago, Brielle. Calder's father. They were circling our family before your dad died, before you ever met Calder. That doesn't mean... It means this was not an accident. It means you need to step away from those documents and call Gerald Hutchins' office right now and tell him what you signed and what they're planning. Right now, before they leave that house. A muffled sound, something between a breath and a word she didn't finish. Mom. Her voice had changed, quieter. Something underneath it that I recognized. The sound of a person standing at the edge of a conclusion they don't want to reach. What if you're wrong? I looked at the house, at the rental car in the driveway, and Diane Moss's car, and the lights on in the downstairs rooms. Then you call Gerald, he tells you I'm wrong, and you go back in there, I said. But if I'm right, every minute you spend in that room with them is a minute they have to finish what they started. A very long pause. I'll call, she said, but Mom, another stopped sentence. What? I'll call, she said again, and hung up. Milked. I sat across the street for 25 minutes. I know it was 25 minutes because I watched the clock on my phone with the focused attention of someone who has nothing to do but wait and everything riding on the outcome. At minute 11, I saw a light go on in the upstairs hallway. Brielle's childhood bedroom, which she'd been using since moving back in. At minute 17, the front door opened and Diane Moss came out. She stood on the porch for a moment, speaking into her phone, her posture carrying the brisk energy of someone receiving unexpected information and calibrating their response. She went back inside. At minute 22, my phone rang. Gerald Hutchins. She called me, he said. Mrs. Vance, your daughter just called my office. I let out a breath I'd been holding. She told me about the documents. I need to see them, but based on what she described, a joint venture framework with co-signatory provisions, what she may have signed could be used to establish a parallel account structure outside the trust's direct jurisdiction. A pause. I'm contacting the investment house now. We may be able to place a temporary hold. May be able to? If the transfer protocols haven't already been initiated. His voice was careful. Mrs. Vance, I need you to understand that if Calder Wynn has already submitted those documents to the investment house, and if they meet the technical threshold for authorization, how much could he access? Based on what your daughter described signing, potentially everything in the liquid accounts. He let that land. Approximately $9,400,000. The number sat in the air of my car like something with weight. Gerald, I said. The notebook. Danny's notebook. There's a recorded phone number in it. An old number for Raymond Wynn that Danny wrote down. Would that help establish Yes, bring me everything. Can you come now? I'm already in the car. I started the engine. Across the street, the light in the upstairs hallway had gone off. I didn't know what was happening inside that house. I didn't know if Brielle was going back downstairs to tell Calder she'd called Gerald, or if she was sitting on the edge of her bed trying to work through the particular sickness of understanding that the person you trusted most in the world was not who you thought they were. I knew what that felt like. I'd been sitting with it for days. I pulled away from the curb and drove toward Gerald Hutchins' office, with Danny's notebook on the passenger seat and the brass key back in my jacket pocket, and a feeling in my chest that was not yet victory, not even close, but was something different from the helpless grief of the last several days. Something sharper. Something that had more traction. I was 40 minutes from Gerald's office when my phone rang again. Brielle. I answered through the car's speaker. I'm on my way to Gerald's. I have the... He's gone. Her voice was flat. That flatness I'd heard traces of earlier, fully arrived now. I told him I'd called Gerald and he left, Mom, just packed a bag, said there was a family emergency in Portland, said he'd call when he landed. A short silence. He won't call. I kept driving, steady speed, hands at 10 and 2. Brielle, the documents are gone too. Her voice fractured for just a moment, then steadied. The copies that were in the folder on the kitchen table, he took them. Gerald has your description of them. And the investment house. I called the investment house. She inhaled. 30 minutes before I called Gerald. They told me a transfer authorization had been submitted that morning. Something cold moved through me. How much? All of it, she said. He submitted authorization for everything in the liquid accounts. They said it was still processing. They said if it hadn't cleared yet, they might be able to... She stopped. A sound that was not quite crying, but was right next to it. Mom, I think I did something really bad. I did not say, yes, you did. I did not say, I told you. I did not say any of the things that were true and accurate and would have been satisfying and completely useless. I said, listen to me. Are you listening? Yes? Go to the front door. Lock it. Do not let anyone in who isn't Gerald Hutchins or me. Do you understand? Yes. Do not answer calls from Calder. Do not answer calls from Diane Moss. Do not touch those documents or that computer or anything Calder used in that house. Mom, Brielle. I said her name the way you say something when you need the whole person to hear it. I am on my way. I am not done. Do you hear me? I am not done. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then very quietly, okay. I pressed the accelerator down and drove faster through the Wednesday afternoon, past strip malls and gas stations, and the ordinary American landscape that doesn't know or care that someone's whole life is being rearranged inside it. I drove and I thought about Calder Wynn in an airport somewhere, or not in an airport, already somewhere else, already composing the next version of himself for the next room full of people he would perform warmth for. I thought about his father circling our family years ago, and my husband sitting at a kitchen table writing careful notes in a black notebook that he folded into a wooden crate in a storage unit with an unmarked brass key. I thought about Brielle at 26, hungry and restless, and ready to believe that the life she'd always wanted had finally and legitimately arrived. And I thought about the $9,400,000 sitting in a processing queue somewhere in a financial institution's server, and whether Danny's careful architecture was strong enough to catch it before it disappeared into whatever shell structure Calder had built to receive it. I didn't know. I genuinely, honestly did not know. That is one of the things I want you to understand about this story, that even in the middle of it, even when I was moving and calling and planning and driving, I was not certain. I was not the woman who had all the answers. I was a 58-year-old widow in a used car driving on 4 hours of sleep toward an executor's office with a dead man's notebook on the passenger seat, hoping, not knowing, just hoping, that what Danny had built was enough. Because that is the truth of these situations. They don't resolve cleanly. They don't arrive at the climax with all the pieces in place. You move, and you hope, and you hold on to the things you know are solid, and you keep going. I kept going. Gerald Hutchins' office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown that smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee, and he was waiting at the elevator when I arrived, which told me everything I needed to know about how seriously he was taking the next few hours. The investment house placed a partial hold, he said, as we walked back to his office. Not everything. They were able to stop approximately $6 million, but 2 transfers, smaller ones, early authorizations, had already cleared this morning before your daughter called. How much cleared? $3.4 million. He held his office door open. Into an account we can't yet identify the holder of. I sat down in the chair across from his desk and put Danny's notebook on the surface between us. Then we find the holder, I said. Gerald sat down. He opened the notebook to the first page, read the first entry. His expression shifted. Not dramatically, but in the way of someone recognizing something they'd hoped not to see. He knew, Gerald said quietly. He knew the shape of it, not the details. I watched him turn the pages. He built this whole thing around the possibility that someone might try to exploit Brielle's position, and then he died before he could tell me any of it. Gerald read in silence for a moment. Then he looked up. Mrs. Vance, the morality clause, the family protection clause, those are in effect. What your daughter signed is contestable on multiple grounds, including potential coercion and the fact that Calder Wynn was acting as an undisclosed interested party. He set the notebook down. This is recoverable. Not all of it, not immediately, but most of it, if we move correctly. What do we need? We need your daughter to sign a sworn statement detailing what happened, what she was told, what she signed, what she understood versus what was actually in those documents. He paused. And we need her to do it voluntarily. This only works if she cooperates. I thought about Brielle's voice on the phone, the flatness, the fractured moment, the okay at the end that had more weight in it than any sentence she'd spoken to me in months. She'll cooperate, I said. Gerald looked at me for a moment. Are you sure? I thought about my daughter sitting in a house she'd taken from me, in a life she'd tried to grab too fast, in the ruins of a plan built by a man who was already, by now, somewhere else. I thought about what it feels like to be 26 and wrong in a way that has real consequences. I thought about the specific devastation of that. Not the money, Not even the danger, but the simple, gutting humiliation of being fooled. She'll cooperate, I said again. She just needs someone to make it possible for her to. Gerald nodded once. Then let's get to work, he said. The afternoon light came through his office window in long, flat angles, the way it does in late October in this part of the country, and we spread Danny's notebook and the archive box documents across the conference table Gerald had set up, and we worked. It was not elegant. It was not fast. There were phone calls and legal consultations and 2 moments where I genuinely wasn't sure the hold on the remaining funds would stick, but it stuck. And somewhere across town, in the house on Orchard Hill Road, my daughter was sitting with her phone in her hands and the beginning of an understanding she hadn't asked for and couldn't yet fully absorb. The understanding that the people who truly stand between you and disaster are not always the ones you expect. Sometimes they're the ones you kicked out in the rain. She came at 5:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I had not been sleeping. I had been lying on that narrow cot in the diner's back office with Danny's notebook on my chest like a talisman, running through the previous day's conversations with Gerald and the way your mind runs through things when it refuses to stop even though the body is exhausted. The partial hold had stuck. The $6 million remaining in the trust's liquid accounts was frozen pending the executor's formal review. The $3.4 million that had already cleared was a different problem. Traceable, Gerald said, but not immediately recoverable. And the process of tracing it would take time and legal coordination and the kind of patience that is very hard to access when you are running on 4 hours of sleep and instant coffee and the specific anxiety of knowing that somewhere out there, Calder Wynn was already building distance between himself and what he'd done. I heard the gravel in the parking lot before I heard anything else. Tires on loose stone, slow and hesitant. The sound of someone who has driven somewhere without being completely sure they should have. Then the engine cutting off. Then silence. I sat up on the cot. A knock at the back door. Not aggressive, not the knock of a process server or someone who expected to be let in. The knock of someone who was not certain they had the right to knock at all. I already knew who it was. I'd known since the moment I heard the tires on gravel. In the same way you know a storm is changing before you can articulate how, something about the pressure, the texture, the particular quality of the air. I'd been waiting for this, or something like it, since the moment she'd said okay on the phone and hung up. But knowing it was coming and being ready for it are not the same thing, and I sat on the edge of that cot for a few seconds before I stood up, because I needed those seconds. I needed to settle something in myself, not resolve it, not tidy it away, just acknowledge it and set it aside with enough deliberateness that it wouldn't run the next few minutes. The anger, the grief, the image of her standing at my door with an eviction notice in the rain while I held myself together through pure force of will. All of that was still present. It didn't disappear because the situation had changed. Emotions don't work that way. They stay exactly where you left them until you deal with them properly, and this was not the moment to deal with them properly. I pulled on my shoes and went to the back door and opened it. Brielle was standing in the pre-dawn dark in a coat I recognized, the old one, not the new one she'd been wearing when she came to my kitchen with the lawyer and the eviction notice. The old one she'd had for years, slightly too big, the kind of coat that survives in a closet, not because it's fashionable, but because it's comfortable and you keep not throwing it out. Her hair was pulled back in a way that looked like it had been neat at some earlier point in the night, and had since lost that particular battle. She was not soaked, it wasn't raining, but there was a dampness to her, the cold morning dampness that settles into you when you've been outside or driving with the window down. And her eyes had the raw, slightly swollen quality of someone who had cried for a long time, and then stopped, and then started again. We looked at each other. She looked in that moment less like the woman who had handed me an eviction notice, and more like the girl I'd rocked through fevers. Both of those people were in her face at once. That's the complicated thing about loving your children. You can be furious at the adult in front of you and heartbroken for the child underneath them simultaneously, and there's no clean way to separate those two responses. They just live in you together. "He came back," she said. Her voice was low and slightly hoarse. "Last night, around midnight." I held the door steady. "Calder?" "He came back to the house, said he hadn't actually left for Portland, just needed to clear his head." A pause. "He wanted me to sign something else. A document that Diane had prepared, but different from the others. I could see it was different. The language was different, more aggressive. And he wanted me to sign it that night, at midnight. What did you do? I told him I'd called Gerald. She watched my face as she said it. It changed. His face changed, Mom. It did this thing I'd never seen it do. She stopped. He didn't get angry exactly. He got cold. It was worse than angry. He told me I'd made a serious mistake, that I'd interfered with a legitimate financial process, that the agreements I'd already signed were binding, and I couldn't just call the executor and pretend they didn't exist. She swallowed. He said I could be liable for breach of the investment agreements. A familiar tactic: reverse the blame. Make the person who's being defrauded feel like the wrongdoer. Make the person trying to stop the theft feel like the criminal. That's not true, I said. I know that now. I didn't know it at midnight when he was standing in my kitchen saying it. She pressed her lips together. I told him to leave. He didn't move for a minute. He just stood there and looked at me the way he sometimes looked at things, like he was calculating something. And then he said very quietly that I should think carefully about whose side I was on. Her jaw tightened, like there were sides, like my own mother was the opponent. And then he left, and I sat in the kitchen until about 4 a.m. trying to figure out what to do, and then I got in my car. She looked down at the gravel. I didn't have anywhere to go. She stopped herself, then started again, differently. I didn't want to go anywhere except here. Even if you didn't let me in. I just wanted to be near. She stopped again. The thing is, I'd planned this moment. Not consciously, but the way you plan for things you know are coming. I'd had versions of it running in the back of my mind for days. What I would say, what I would require from her before I opened that door all the way. How I would hold the line between forgiveness and the kind of swift, easy reconciliation that papers over things that need to be addressed. But I had not planned for the particular exhaustion in her face, or the old coat, or the way she'd said near and stopped herself. I stepped back from the door. Come inside, I said. I'll make coffee. She came in. She looked around the diner, Xiao, really looked at it, the way someone looks at a place they're encountering for the first time in their full attention. And I watched her see it. The Formica counter, the round stools, the booths with the cracked vinyl, the faded menu board still on the wall with Danny's prices from years ago. The particular worn-in character of a place that has absorbed a lot of living. Dad's diner, she said quietly. Yes. She sat down on one of the counter stools while I worked the small burner. Neither of us spoke for a couple of minutes. The silence was not comfortable, but it was not hostile either. It was the silence of two people who have a great deal to say and are not sure what order to say it in. I set a mug in front of her. She wrapped both hands around it the way she'd done since she was a teenager. She's always been a person who holds a hot mug with both hands, absorbing the warmth. Some gestures stay in people from childhood all the way through. You look for them sometimes, those surviving gestures. They remind you who a person actually is underneath everything else. I need to say something, she said. Okay. And I need you to not respond until I'm done. Because if you respond, I'll lose the thread and I need to get through all of it. I nodded. She stared at her coffee for a moment, then looked up at me. What I did was wrong, she said. Not legally wrong, though it was that too. I mean, morally wrong. The eviction notice. Bringing Diane to your house, treating you like a tenant, like a problem to be managed. Her voice was even, controlled, but barely. You raised me alone. You worked at that estate for 11 years keeping someone else's life running, and you came home and kept ours running too, and you never once made me feel like a burden, even when I know I was. Even when I know it was hard. Her fingers tightened on the mug. And I handed you a legal document in the rain, in your own house. She stopped. In our house. I kept quiet. I'd said I would. Calder told me that taking control of the assets was what a smart woman would do. He said you'd had access to Dad's estate for years and hadn't done anything with it, and that you'd probably try to control the inheritance too, and that I needed to establish my authority before you could... She shook her head slowly. He made you the villain. He needed you to be the villain so that I wouldn't look too closely at him. She put the mug down. I let him do that, she said. He didn't do it alone. I let him because part of me wanted to. Part of me wanted to believe I could just step into a new life and not need to be taken care of anymore. Not need you to be the person who fixed things. A slightly unsteady breath. I'm 26. I've been leaning on you my whole life and I'm ashamed of it. And that shame made it easier to believe the things he said. Because if you were the problem, then I didn't have to look at how scared I was. A silence. Okay, I said. I'm responding now. She nodded. You were wrong, I said. What you did hurt me. I'm not going to tell you it didn't, because it did, and you deserve to carry that knowledge, not because I want you to suffer with it, but because you need to understand the full weight of what that kind of choice costs another person. I paused. But I also know that you were scared, and I know that Calder is very skilled at finding the scared places in people and building houses there. That doesn't excuse what you did. It just means you weren't stupid, exactly. You were targeted, and there's a difference. She looked at me. There's a difference, I said again, between being fooled and being a fool. You got fooled. You can recover from that. What you can't do is let it happen twice. It won't, she said. Good. I picked up my own coffee. Now, tell me everything Calder said last night. Exactly. Because Gerald needs a sworn statement, and we need to move today. Awesome. We sat in that diner for 3 hours. The light came up outside. Route 9 waking up, the occasional truck, the slow brightening of an October morning that didn't know or care what was happening in our particular corner of it. And Brielle talked, and I listened, and I asked questions and wrote things down in the back of Danny's notebook, in the blank pages at the end, which felt right. Danny had started the documentation. We were finishing it. The details Brielle gave me filled in gaps I hadn't known existed. Calder had not been as careful as he thought he'd been, or he had assumed, which is the mistake confident people make, that the person he was underestimating would stay underestimated. He had used Brielle's laptop for some of the communication with the investment house, which meant those communications existed in an account she had access to. He had also, in the week since the inheritance notification, created what he told Brielle was a family investment portfolio, a set of accounts he'd presented as jointly managed for her benefit, but which, when Brielle walked me through the login he'd given her for the portal, turned out to be structured with him as the primary authorized party and Brielle as a secondary, non-authorizing account holder. She could see the account. She could not move anything in it. He could move everything in it. The $3.4 million that had cleared before Gerald's hold went straight into that account. We could see it sitting there in the portal. We could not touch it. The password he gave you for the portal, I said. Did he give it to you in writing? A text? An email? She looked at her phone, scrolled back, found a text message from 3 weeks ago where Calder had sent her a login and password with the note. Your access to the family investment portal. Check it anytime. Everything is transparent. Everything is transparent. I photographed the screen. Forward that text to yourself and then to my email, I said. And don't delete anything. Any text he sent you, any email, anything. There are texts where he told me the executor review was a formality, she said, where he said Gerald was a procedural obstacle who got paid to delay things. Forward all of it. There are texts where he described you as... She stopped. As a financial liability, as someone who had benefited from Dad's estate informally for years and would try to continue doing so. The specific contempt of that, the way Calder had packaged my 23 years of marriage and grief and work into the phrase financial liability, was something I felt in my back teeth, but I kept my expression neutral. Forward those too, I said. Especially those. By the time Patrice arrived at 7:30, I'd called her at 6, and she had arrived with breakfast sandwiches from a drive-through 3 towns over, because she is fundamentally a practical woman who understands that people make better decisions when they've eaten. We had assembled the skeleton of what Gerald had called the sworn statement. Brielle's account of events, supported by the documentary evidence from her phone and the investment portal. Patrice sat down across from Brielle, set the food on the table between them, and looked at my daughter for a long moment. Brielle met her eyes. I know what you think of me right now. You don't. Patrice said evenly. What I think of you right now is that you drove here at 5 in the morning in your old coat, and you've spent 3 hours helping your mother build a case. That's not nothing. A pause. What you did before that was something I won't sugarcoat, but what you're doing now is also something. She slid a breakfast sandwich across the counter. Eat! Brielle almost smiled. It was small, exhausted, and more genuine than anything I'd seen from her in months. We ate. We worked. By 9 a.m., I was back on the phone with Gerald. She's here, I said. She's willing to sign a statement. She has text documentation and portal access. Gerald's exhale carried genuine relief. Mrs. Vance, I need to tell you something I couldn't tell you last night. The investment house flagged the account structure as potentially non-compliant this morning, independently of our hold request. The way the account was set up had characteristics consistent with a financial exploitation structure. They're cooperating fully with the review. A brief pause. And this morning, I was contacted by a detective from the County Financial Crimes Unit. Apparently, Calder Wynn's name has appeared in connection with a complaint from another family in the next county. A similar scheme, smaller scale. He'd done this before. Not just the dissolved firm, the regulatory complaints. He had done this specific thing. Found a family with a pending inheritance, cultivated a relationship with the most accessible member, moved to control the assets. How many times? I asked. The detective indicated this may be the third known instance. Possibly more. Gerald's voice was careful. Which means what your daughter can provide, current, detailed documentation from inside the scheme, is significantly more valuable to an investigation than just your family's case. I looked at Brielle across the counter. She was reading through the draft statement on Patrice's laptop, making small corrections, her pen moving steadily. She looked, in that moment, like someone doing work that matters. Not comfortable work, not easy work, but necessary. She'll talk to the detective, I said. I'll make sure of it. The detective's name was Sasha Reeves, and she arrived at the diner at 11:15 with a partner and a digital recorder and the specific professional demeanor of someone who has heard a lot of difficult stories and has learned to hold them without flinching. She was younger than I expected. Early 40s maybe, with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses she kept taking on and off. She shook my hand first, then Brielle's, and she sat across from my daughter in the corner booth with her recorder between them and a legal pad on the table. I sat at the counter with Patrice, close enough to be present, far enough to let Brielle speak for herself. I'll tell you what I observed from that distance, because I think it matters more than what I could have heard up close. What I observed was my daughter's posture changing over the course of that interview. She came in sitting slightly hunched, the defensive curl of someone who expects to be judged. And over the first 20 minutes, she gradually straightened. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the way a person straightens when they realize they are being heard rather than evaluated. When they understand that the person across from them wants the truth and is equipped to do something with it. Brielle was in that booth for 2 hours and 14 minutes. She came out looking like she'd run a distance she hadn't trained for. Wrung out, slightly pale, but with a particular quality in her eyes that hadn't been there at 5:47 in the morning when she knocked on the back door. Something that looked a little like agency, like someone who had been moved around a board like a piece and had decided to pick herself up and step off the board entirely. Detective Reeves shook her hand at the door. "You did the right thing," Reeves said. "I know that feels inadequate right now." "It does, a little," Brielle said honestly. "It usually does at first." Reeves glanced at me, then back at Brielle. "We'll be in touch. Don't go anywhere without letting my office know." After Reeves and her partner left, Brielle sat down at the counter next to me. Neither of us said anything for a moment. "She said there might be charges," Brielle said, "that what Calder submitted to the investment house, the authorization forms, might constitute wire fraud. Forgery if the signatures were modified from the originals I signed." "I know. Were they? Modified?" "Gerald thinks so. The language in what you described signing doesn't match what was submitted to the investment house, which means he altered them." She absorbed that quietly. "She also said," Brielle continued, "that I might need to testify, if they find him and it goes to trial." "I know that too. Will you—" She stopped, started again. Would you be there? If I had to testify. I looked at my daughter. The question was so careful, so tentative, like she wasn't sure she had the right to ask after everything, like she understood she'd used up a significant portion of whatever credit she'd once had and wasn't sure how much remained. I thought about the rain, the eviction notice, the 72 hours, the way her jaw had set when I asked if she really wanted me to leave. I thought about a lot of things in the 3 seconds before I answered. Yes, I said. I'd be there. She nodded, just once, and turned back to her coffee. That afternoon was the strangest one in a week of strange afternoons. Patrice left at 2 o'clock to get back to her work. Brielle stayed. She helped me clear some of the back storage room. Not because I asked her to, but because after a while the sitting and the waiting becomes unbearable, and physical work is the only thing that metabolizes it. We moved boxes and swept and didn't talk much, and there was something almost not peaceful, not quite, but functional about it. Two people working in the same space toward the same general direction. At 4 o'clock, Gerald called. The Financial Crimes Unit has made contact with the investment house directly, he said. They've been cooperative. The account Calder established is now under a legal hold, which means the $3.4 million that transferred is frozen pending the investigation. It's not returned yet, Mrs. Vance. I want to be clear about that, but it's stopped. I sat down on a storage crate in the back room. Stopped, I said. He can't touch it. If the investigation proceeds as Detective Reeves indicated, recovery is likely, though it will take time. A brief pause. There's something else. This morning I formally notified the Trust's investment administrator that in my determination as executor, the conditions of the morality clause have been violated. Specifically, the eviction of a protected family member, the unauthorized attempt to transfer trust assets, and the introduction of a financially exploitative third party into the beneficiary's decision-making. He paused again. I've placed the full trust under executor management, temporarily, until a review period is complete and I'm satisfied with the beneficiary's financial decision-making capacity. Brielle had come to the doorway of the storage room. She'd heard me pick up and had stopped there, watching my face. I held her gaze as Gerald kept talking. This means the trust is technically frozen for Brielle's independent use, Gerald said. However, the income from the estate investments, the quarterly returns, can be designated for specific approved purposes during the review period. Mrs. Vance, your husband's instructions, in the event of exactly this kind of situation, were clear. He named you as the oversight manager during any executor review period. He named me, I said. Yes. He was very specific. Quote, in the event the primary beneficiary demonstrates poor financial judgment sufficient to trigger the morality clause, the oversight role during the review period should fall to my wife, Marla Vance, who has the experience, judgment, and character to manage this responsibly. A small pause. His words, not mine, though I agree with them. I was quiet for a moment. How long is the review period? Minimum 90 days, potentially longer depending on the investigation's timeline. Gerald cleared his throat. Mrs. Vance, I want to be direct with you. Calder Wynn has not been located yet. He may have crossed state lines. The investigation may take months. During that time, the trust remains under your management oversight. Your daughter receives an allowance. I'd suggest something modest and appropriate. And access to the trust resumes in full only after the review period closes and I'm satisfied. Brielle was still in the doorway. She had heard enough of it to understand the shape of what was being said. Her expression was hard to read. Not resentment, not exactly. Something more complicated. Something that knew it was fair. I understand, I said to Gerald. I'll need to talk to Brielle. Of course. I'll send the formal paperwork this evening. A pause. Mrs. Vance, your husband built a very good structure. I've been doing this work for 30 years, and I don't often see a trust this carefully designed. He thought about this for a long time. He was that kind of man, I said. I hung up. Brielle and I looked at each other across the storage room, across the boxes and the dust and the general evidence of a place that had been closed up for a long time and was not yet anything close to what it was going to be. The trust is under executor management, I said, with me as oversight during the review period, Gerald's terms. I know, I heard some of it. She leaned against the doorframe. Are you okay with that? The question caught me slightly off guard. Not its content, but its tone. The genuine asking of it, not defensive, not challenging, just asking. It's not a question of whether I'm okay with it, I said. It's what your father arranged. I know what Dad arranged. I'm asking if you're okay with it, with being responsible for all of that. For the next 90 days minimum while this investigation runs. She met my eyes. That's a lot to ask of someone. It's a lot to ask of someone who hasn't had her daughter evict her recently, I said. Dry, not unkind, just honest. Brielle looked down at her shoes. A small sound that might have been a quarter of a laugh. Yeah, she said, there's that. I'll manage, I said. The trust and the review period. That's what I do. I manage things. And I'll be fair, Brielle. Not soft. Fair. There's a difference. I know there's a difference. She looked up. I think I'm just starting to understand what it actually means. I nodded. Outside, the October light was going. Route 9 was beginning to quiet down toward evening. The diner stood around us with its particular patience, absorbing this moment the way it had absorbed whatever moments had come before in its decades of existing. Without comment, without judgment, just holding the space. Where are you staying tonight? I asked. She looked around the back room, at the cot, the small office, the secondhand chair in the corner that I'd dragged in from storage 2 days ago. I thought, she said, if there's space, I can sleep in my car if... There's a second cot in that corner, I said. I found it in the storage unit. It's dusty. I don't mind dusty. There are spare blankets in the cabinet above the sink. She didn't say thank you. I didn't need her to. What she did was walk over to the corner, pull the second cot out from against the wall, unfold it with the practical efficiency of someone who has decided to stop being paralyzed by the situation and just deal with the situation and drag it over near the wall opposite mine. We were not reconciled, not in the full sense, not in the sense of the word that implies a return to what existed before. What existed before wasn't actually good enough. I had learned that, slowly, in the days of sitting in this diner with Danny's notebook and a thermos of coffee and the long, uncomfortable honesty of having nothing else to do but think. We were two people at the beginning of something different, something that would take time and honesty and probably a lot more difficult conversations in this diner and elsewhere before it looked like anything worth calling healed. But we were in the same room. The key was on the counter where I'd left it that morning. I picked it up and held it for a moment, feeling the warm weight of it, and I thought about Danny, about the man who had laid careful plans for a future he wouldn't be present for, who had trusted that the people he loved would eventually find their way to the structures he'd built for them. I thought about what Gerald had said. He thought about this for a long time. Yeah, Danny, you did. From the back room, the sound of Brielle pulling blankets from the cabinet, shaking dust from them, the ordinary noise of a person making a place livable. Not elegant, not painless, but forward-moving. I set the key back on the counter. I started thinking about what a kitchen full of working equipment might need to look like, and whether the county codes for commercial food service had changed in the last 5 years, and whether Patrice knew anyone in the contractor world who owed her a favor. Because that is what I do when everything is complicated and nothing is resolved, and the night is coming in through the boarded windows of a closed-down diner on Route 9. I find the thing that needs doing, and I start figuring out how to do it. Calder Wynn was arrested on a Tuesday morning, 11 weeks after he walked out of the house on Orchard Hill Road with a bag and a folder of documents, and the particular confidence of a man who has done this before and gotten away with it. He was found in Phoenix, Arizona. Not hiding, exactly, staying in a furnished short-term rental under a variation of his name, Calder Weiner, which told you everything about how careful he actually was when the pressure came off. Detective Reeves called me at 7:43 in the morning, and I was standing at the diner's kitchen pass-through with a coffee in one hand and a contractor's invoice in the other. And when she said, "We have him," I had to set both things down and press my palm flat on the counter because my hand had started shaking in a way I hadn't expected and couldn't immediately stop. "He's being extradited," Reeves said. Wire fraud, forgery, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, 3 counts across 2 states. Your family's case is the strongest documentation we have, which means you'll likely be the primary complainants when this goes to trial. When, I said, not if. When, she confirmed. He made mistakes, Mrs. Vance. Arrogant people usually do. He left a data trail because he believed he'd be gone before anyone thought to look for one. I thanked her. I hung up. I stood in the kitchen of the diner I had spent 11 weeks systematically bringing back to life, and I let the shaking in my hand run its course, and then I picked up my coffee and went to find my daughter. Brielle was in the back booth with her laptop and a notepad covered in her handwriting. She had been taking an online accounting course for 6 weeks, one of the conditions Gerald and I had agreed on for the review period, along with weekly check-ins with Gerald's office and a financial literacy program run through the county library that she had initially resisted and then, somewhere around week 3, stopped resisting. She looked up when she saw my face. "They got him," I said. She put down her pen. I watched something move through her that I couldn't fully name. Not triumph, not quite relief, but something in the neighborhood of both, underneath which was a more complicated current. The grief of understanding, fully and finally, what Calder had actually been. Not a man who loved her badly or impulsively, a man who had never loved her at all, who had looked at her hunger for a bigger life and seen not a person to cherish but a mechanism to exploit. That is a specific kind of wound, one of the deepest I know of. It doesn't heal on a predictable schedule, and it leaves a scar that changes the shape of how you trust people going forward, sometimes permanently. I knew that. I wanted her to have the space to know it too. "Okay," she said. Quiet. Just that one word. "Reeves says when it goes to trial, we'll need to testify." "I know." She looked down at her notepad. "I've been thinking about that. I want to testify, Mom. I don't want to be the person who lets him do this to someone else's family because she was too embarrassed to stand up in a courtroom." "You're sure?" She met my eyes. "I'm sure." I nodded. I took the stool at the counter nearest her booth, and we sat in the particular quiet of 2 people who have said most of what needs to be said and are now simply existing in the same space together, which is its own kind of thing. Not the same as easy, but something. Outside, the November light came through the front windows of the diner. The real windows now. The boards gone since mid-October, when the contractor Patrice had found came in with his crew and replaced 2 cracked panes and repaired the frames. The diner looked like itself again from the outside. Maybe better than itself, because the sign had been repainted and the parking lot had been patched, and there were window boxes along the front sill that Brielle had planted with cold, hardy herbs on a Sunday afternoon, when she needed something physical to do with the restlessness that still moved through her in waves. It was not finished. It was nowhere close to finished. But it was a thing becoming itself, which is different from finished and in some ways more interesting. I should tell you what happened to the house on Orchard Hill Road. Gerald had been clear from the beginning that the house, as a component of the estate assets, was subject to the executor's management during the review period, which meant that Brielle could not sell it, rent it, or make decisions about it independently, which also meant that technically I could have gone back. I did not go back. I want to explain that choice because it matters, because some people hearing this story will expect that the resolution involves me reclaiming the physical space, walking back through the door of the house where I raised my daughter and lived with my husband and built my daily life for 23 years. And I understand why that would feel like justice. I understand the narrative logic of it. But here's what I understood by week 4 in the diner, somewhere between the contractor's first visit and the moment I figured out how to get the industrial dishwasher running again. That house had become, in my mind, a monument to a version of my life that was finished. Not the people in it, not Danny's memory, not the years of raising Brielle. None of that was finished or dismissible, but the life of managing things for other people, of making myself small enough to fit inside a structure built around someone else's needs. That version of me had been developing for decades, and the eviction, as brutal as it was, had cracked it open in a way that turned out to be irreversible. I didn't want to go back to the house. I wanted to build something. So the house was listed. Gerald managed the sale, with Brielle's formal agreement and my oversight sign-off. And it sold in 6 weeks to a young family with 2 kids who asked, when they came for the final walkthrough, whether the oak trees had always been that big. I told them yes. I told them the trees were the best thing about the property, and they should never cut them down. They promised they wouldn't. I stood in the driveway for a few minutes after the walkthrough, alone. The young couple had gone back inside with their realtor, and I had said I needed a moment, and they had understood, with the graceful sensitivity of people who recognize a moment they shouldn't intrude on. I looked at the house, the windows I had cleaned hundreds of times, the porch where I had sat on summer evenings, the front door through which I had carried 23 years of ordinary, enormous, unremarkable life. I said goodbye to it the way you say goodbye to something you're not going to see again, quietly, internally, with the full weight of what you're putting down. And then I got in my car and drove back to Route 9. The proceeds from the sale went into the trust, under Gerald's management. They would eventually become Brielle's after the review period with conditions. But a specific portion that Danny had outlined in his original trust documentation, under a clause Gerald said he'd almost missed because it was written in the plainest possible language at the bottom of page 11, was designated for exactly what I was already building. The clause read, "If the diner property on Route 9 is still in family ownership at the time of this trust's execution, I would like a portion of the estate to be used for its restoration, at the discretion of the trustee. It was my father's place, and I always thought it deserved better than what we gave it." Danny had thought of that too. Of course he had. The formal reopening of Vance House happened on a Saturday in late January, in the particular cold that settles into this part of the country after the holidays, when the excitement of winter has worn off, and what remains is just the practical reality of getting through February. It was not a glamorous opening. We did not have a ribbon or a ceremony or catered food. What we had was a working kitchen, 6 functioning booths, a counter with 8 stools, a hand-lettered sign in the window that Patrice's daughter had designed, and a line of 12 women standing in the parking lot at 7:58 a.m., waiting for the door to open. They were from the women's shelter 2 towns over. Patrice had been working with the shelter's director for 3 weeks, establishing the arrangement. Vance House would provide 2 hot meals a day, 5 days a week, for women in the shelter's transitional housing program. The meals were subsidized by the portion of the trust's quarterly income that Gerald had approved for charitable purposes during the review period. The labor for now was a skeleton crew. Me, Brielle, a retired cook named Harold, who had worked at a diner 3 counties over for 30 years, and was deeply bored in retirement and profoundly opinionated about the correct way to make hash browns, and 2 women from the shelter program who were in job training and learning front-of-house work. I stood at the door at 8 a.m. and opened it. The first woman who walked in was somewhere in her mid-40s, carrying a tote bag and a toddler on her hip. She looked around the diner the way people look at places they're not sure they deserve to be comfortable in, that particular wary scan. Then she looked at me. "You're the owner?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "It's nice," she said. "It's warm." "Booth or counter?" I asked. She took a booth. The toddler immediately grabbed the paper placemat and tried to eat it, and she apologized, and I told her not to worry about it. And Harold came out of the kitchen with a small dish of crackers he'd thought to put together for exactly this kind of situation, because Harold was 67 and had raised 4 kids and understood things without being asked to. That first morning was chaotic, in the specific way that first mornings always are. Things that should have been in the right places weren't. The coffee station had a slow leak we didn't discover until 40 minutes in. One of the training staff got overwhelmed and needed to step outside for 10 minutes. It was not smooth. Nothing real ever is. But by 9:30, all 12 women had been fed. The toddler had fallen asleep in the booth with the eaten placemat under her head. Harold was in the kitchen telling Brielle his definitive opinion about the correct seasoning ratio for home fries, and Brielle was arguing back with more confidence than I'd heard from her in months. And the sound of that particular argument, domestic, ordinary, 2 people debating breakfast food in a warm kitchen while the world did its thing outside, was one of the better sounds I had heard in a long time. I sat down at the counter for a moment. Just a moment. I thought about what this place had been. A squat building off a frontage road, closed and dusty, holding Danny's memories and nobody else's attention. I thought about what it was now, what it was becoming, something that fed people, something with heat and light, and Harold's hash browns, and the sound of a toddler getting cracker crumbs on a vinyl seat. I thought about Danny, who had written at the bottom of page 11 of a trust document, "I always thought it deserved better than what we gave it." Yeah, Danny, me too. So, the trial came in the spring. I will not give you every detail of those 3 days in the courtroom, because some of it belongs to the private record, and some of it is still too recent to reduce to narrative. What I will tell you is what I observed and what I felt and what I understood by the end of it. Calder Wynn's defense attorney tried 3 different strategies, more or less in succession. The first was to characterize the investment agreements as legitimate, the transfers as authorized, and the entire situation as a civil dispute between family members into which Calder had been drawn as a professional advisor acting in good faith. That strategy collapsed under the weight of Gerald's testimony, the investment house's records, and the documented gap between what Brielle had been told she was signing and what had actually been submitted. The second strategy was to imply that Brielle had been an active and willing participant, that she had understood what she was doing and was now distancing herself to avoid her own accountability. I watched Brielle on the witness stand during those questions. I watched her sit very straight and answer very clearly, without crying, without getting angry, without the defensive performance that the defense attorney was clearly trying to provoke. She said, "I signed documents I was told were investment frameworks. I was not told they established an account structure that gave Calder Wynn unilateral control over funds. I believed I was managing jointly. I was not given the opportunity for independent legal review. I was told there wasn't time." She said it the way someone says something they have rehearsed not for the purpose of performance, but for the purpose of not losing the thread of it in a high-pressure moment. The third strategy was to attack my credibility and Danny's documentation, to suggest that the storage unit records were assembled after the fact, that the notebook was not contemporaneous, that the whole architecture of the trust's protective clauses was a retroactive invention by a disgruntled family member trying to control her daughter's inheritance. Gerald dismantled that in approximately 20 minutes of testimony using the original dated filings, the correspondence records, and the investment house's independent verification of the document trail going back 19 years. On the third day before closing arguments, Calder Wynn's attorney requested a brief recess. When they came back, he entered a guilty plea on 2 of the 3 counts: wire fraud, forgery. The financial exploitation charge went to sentencing as a concurrent count. He was sentenced to 7 years. He would serve a minimum of 4. The $3.4 million that had transferred was ordered to be repaid as part of the restitution judgment. Not all of it would be recoverable immediately, Gerald warned me, because Calder had moved portions of it through multiple accounts in the weeks before his arrest. But the legal order was in place. The mechanism was running. It would take time. I could live with time. I had become, over the previous months, a person who had made a kind of peace with time, with the fact that things don't resolve on your schedule, that recovery is not an event, but a process, that the only thing you can control is whether you keep moving while the process runs. Brielle and I walked out of the courthouse on a Thursday afternoon in April, into the particular brightness of a spring day that doesn't know or care what just concluded inside the building behind you. She was wearing the old coat again, the comfortable one. She'd stopped wearing the new one sometime in November, and I didn't know if that was conscious or not, but I noticed it. We stood on the courthouse steps for a moment. "Okay," she said. An exhale. "Okay," I agreed. "I want to say something, and I don't want you to deflect it," she said. "Go ahead." "I am sorry." She turned to look at me directly. Not at the steps, not at the parking lot, at me. "I know I said it in the diner that morning, and I meant it then. But I want to say it again now, here, because I think the weight of it is different today than it was then. I understand more now about what I actually did and what it cost you, and I am sorry. For the eviction notice and for what led up to it and for the years of not seeing what I should have seen." A pause. "I'm going to be sorry about it for a long time. I just want you to know I know that." I looked at my daughter in the April light outside the courthouse, 26 years old. A little thinner than she'd been before all of this, a little quieter in the particular way of someone who has had their assumptions about themselves disrupted and is still in the process of building new ones. Not the woman she'd been before the inheritance notification, Not the woman she'd been in the brief, terrible period between that call and Calder's departure. Something else. Someone who had been through a fire and come out changed in ways that wouldn't be fully visible for years. "I know you are," I said, "and I accept it. Both things are true." She nodded. "The review period ends next month," she said. "I know." "Gerald says the trust management returns to me fully, with conditions still, but—" She paused. "I want to talk to you about what I want to do with it. Not as the beneficiary reporting to the oversight manager. As your daughter, asking for your opinion because I want your opinion, not because I'm required to." "We can talk about it," I said. "Not today." "No," I agreed. "Not today." We walked down the courthouse steps together. Not arm in arm, not hand in hand. We are not, either of us, the kind of people who move back toward physical closeness quickly or easily. We walked side by side with about 8 inches between us, which was something, which was actually more than it sounds. The summer that followed was quieter than anything that had come before it, which was not the same as easy, but was its own kind of gift. Vance House expanded to 7 days a week in June, when Gerald approved an additional allocation from the Trust's charitable designation, and Harold hired his niece, who turned out to be a genuinely skilled short-order cook, with the ability to produce breakfast food at a speed that Harold found both impressive and personally threatening to his sense of seniority. We served an average of 30 women a week through the shelter partnership, and in July we opened 2 lunch services to the general public, which was Brielle's idea, and which generated enough revenue to cover the staff costs without drawing on the trust. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the thing I was most proud of, that the diner could, increasingly, hold its own weight. Brielle had been working the counter 6 days a week since January. I want to be clear about what that meant, practically. She woke up at 5:30 in the morning and drove to Route 9 and tied an apron on and took orders and carried plates and refilled coffee and handled whatever a Thursday morning in a community diner handles, which is sometimes routine and sometimes a woman crying in a booth, because the night before had been hard, and Brielle had learned, gradually, imperfectly, in the halting way that real learning happens, how to be present for that, how to put down a cup of coffee and not rush away, how to say, "Take your time and mean it." She was not a natural. She got frustrated. She had days where the work wore on her in ways she hadn't anticipated, and she was less patient than she should have been and then had to go back and be honest about it. She spilled things. She had a 3-week period in March where she and Harold were in open conflict about the proper temperature for scrambled eggs, and I had to mediate twice and take Harold's side once, which Brielle did not love but accepted. But she stayed. Every morning. She tied the apron and she stayed. That meant something. Not because the work itself was redemptive in some simple, tidy way. I don't believe in that kind of simplicity. It meant something because choosing to do hard, unglamorous work when you could choose not to is a statement about who you're deciding to be. And Brielle was deciding, day by day and plate by plate, in the imperfect and recurring way that decisions actually get made. In August, she sat down with me and Gerald and told us what she wanted to do with the trust when the review period closed. She wanted to formalize Vance House as a nonprofit. She wanted to expand the Women's Transitional Housing Partnership. She wanted to use a portion of the trust income to establish a small financial literacy fund, workshops, resources, the kind of practical education about money and contracts, and how to read a document before you sign it that she had never received and that she believed, based on her own experience and the conversation she'd had with women in the shelter program, was one of the most significant gaps in most people's practical education. She looked at Gerald across the conference table as she laid this out. Then she looked at me. "You think it's too much," she said. "Too fast." "I think it's ambitious," I said. "That's different from too much." "Yes," I said, "it is." Gerald set down his pen. "Miss Vance, the trust can support this structurally. The charitable designation, the nonprofit formation, these are achievable, and they align with your father's original intent in ways that I find—" He paused and did something I had rarely seen Gerald Hutchins do, which was allow a personal note into his professional voice. "Your father would have approved of this. I want you to know that, not as a legal opinion, just as someone who read his correspondence for many years." Brielle looked down at the table. A brief moment. Then she steadied. Okay, she said. Then let's figure out how to do it. Shout. The deed arrived on a Friday morning in October, 1 year and 3 weeks after Calder Wynne had sat in my kitchen with the practiced calm of a man who had already won. 1 year and 3 weeks after the inheritance call that had cracked our lives open like a fault line running through a landscape that looked stable. Brielle brought it to me at the diner. She came in during the slow hour between the breakfast rush and the lunch service, when the place was quiet except for Harold in the kitchen arguing with his niece about soup stock. She sat down at the counter and she slid a manila envelope across the formica. I looked at her. Open it, she said. It was the deed to a property on Lake Carver, about 12 miles east of town, small. A lakeside house with a covered porch and 2 bedrooms and, according to Brielle, a kitchen that would need significant updating but had good bones. I read through it twice. My name was on it. Brielle, I bought it, she said, from my share, from what I've saved from the counterwork and from the first quarterly distribution after the review period closed, which was not very much, but it was enough, combined for something modest. She met my eyes. It's not the house on Orchard Hill Road. I know that. I'm not trying to replace it. She stopped. You don't have a home, Mom. You've been sleeping on a cot in the back of a diner for a year, which you will tell me is fine, and I know you well enough to know that you half mean it. But you deserve an actual home. I sat with the deed in my hands. I have been asked since then what I felt in that moment. It's a reasonable question. The simple answer is that I felt many things simultaneously, in that layered way that significant moments always arrive. Not one clean emotion, but a whole complicated chord of them. Gratitude. The specific grief of accepting something from your child that should flow the other direction. A strange, echoing tenderness for the woman across the counter who had evicted me 12 months ago in the rain and was now handing me a house key. Pride, actually. That one surprised me a little. Not the satisfied pride of someone whose plan worked out. A different kind. The kind you feel when someone you love does something genuinely hard and genuinely good, not because anyone required it of them, but because they decided to. It needs a new kitchen, I said. I know. And the porch is probably not winterized. Probably not. I'll need Harold to stop telling me how to run the diner before I have the bandwidth to deal with a renovation project. She almost smiled. The real one. That might take a while. Yes, I agreed. I put the deed back in the envelope. I held the envelope for a moment, feeling the weight of it, which was not much physically, just paper, but was the kind of thing that weighs more than its components. Thank you, I said. She nodded. I reached into my jacket pocket. The brass key was there, as it almost always was. I'd gotten into the habit of carrying it, not because it was useful anymore, but because it had become a kind of anchor. A physical reminder of Danny, of the storage unit, of the afternoon everything changed. I put it on the counter between us. She looked at it. That's Dad's, she said. I know. I want you to have it. She looked at me. Why? Because it's the thing that started all of this, and because it should stay in your hands now. I slid it toward her. He built structures to protect you, Brielle. You understand that now. I want you to remember it, every time you see that key, not as a warning, as evidence. Evidence of what? That somebody loved you enough to think 20 years ahead. I held her gaze. And that you turned out to be worth it. She picked up the key, held it the way I had held it 100 times, in her palm, feeling the weight of it. Her jaw tightened slightly, which is what happens with Brielle when she is working to hold something together. I'll remember, she said. I believed her. I want to tell you something before this story closes, because I think it's the thing underneath all the rest of it. The thing the money and the drama and the legal proceedings were always really about, even when it didn't look that way. I spent most of my adult life being useful. Useful to Danny, useful to Brielle, useful to the Ashford family and their estate and their hand towels that needed replacing before anyone had to ask. I was very good at useful. And somewhere along the way, useful had become a way of not asking whether I was also being seen, whether I was also being valued, not for what I managed or maintained or kept running, but for who I actually was? I had let that question sit unanswered for a long time. Not because I was a martyr. I wasn't, and I don't tell this story to make myself into one, but because I was busy and because asking the question felt self-indulgent when there was always something else that needed doing, and because, if I'm being fully honest, I was a little afraid of what the answer might be if I really listened for it. The eviction notice was the most painful thing my daughter ever did to me. I will not soften that. It came from a place of fear and manipulation and the specific vulnerability of wanting to believe that sudden wealth makes you powerful, and I understand all of those things, but understanding them doesn't make the pain smaller. It was the most painful thing she ever did to me, and it also cracked me open in a way that turned out to be necessary, because on the other side of that pain was the diner, the notebook. Danny's careful long-game love, built into a document I hadn't known existed. Patrice and her practical intelligence and her breakfast sandwiches and her absolute refusal to let me be only calm and sad when what I needed to be was also strategic. Brielle eventually, in her old coat at 5:47 in the morning, choosing to knock instead of drive away. The women who come through Vance's house now, who sit in the booths and drink coffee and let themselves be warm for an hour, which is not nothing, which is in fact quite a lot. And the lakeside house with its questionable kitchen and its unwinterized porch, where I now sit on Saturday mornings and drink coffee in actual quiet, in a space that is mine, that nobody can hand me an eviction notice for. I am not the same woman who stood in that rain and closed the door. I am not even sure I would want to be. She was a woman who had learned to make herself small enough to fit inside other people's structures. I am trying now to be a woman who builds her own. It is harder than managing someone else's estate. It is harder than holding another family's household together. It requires a different kind of courage. Not the courage of endurance, which I had in abundance, but the courage of claiming space, claiming value, claiming the right to say, this is mine, and I will not be moved from it, not by eviction notices, not by lawyers, not by the manipulative calculations of men who see a family's grief as a business opportunity. Brielle is learning that too, in her own way, at her own pace. She has not finished learning it. Neither am I. We have conversations that are still hard, still raw in the edges, still occasionally derailed by the accumulated weight of things we said and did and failed to say and do over the years before any of this happened. We are not a fixed thing. We are a working thing. But she calls on Thursdays. Not because I asked her to. She just started doing it somewhere around February, calling on Thursday evenings from the diner after closing. And we talk about the week and the shelter partnership and whatever Harold has decided to be opinionated about now. And sometimes we talk about Danny, which is still tender, but is also becoming something else. Something like comfort. The good kind of grief, if there is such a thing. The kind that softens as it ages instead of hardening. Danny would have been proud of all of it. The diner and the nonprofit and the lakeside house, and the fact that his daughter is learning accounting and his wife is finally, at 58, building something that is entirely, unambiguously, irreversibly hers. He knew when he put that brass key in a desk drawer and that letter in a storage box in that clause at the bottom of page 11 that the people he loved were capable of more than they were currently asking of themselves. He was right about that. He was, in the long game, quiet way of him, almost always right. The last Saturday morning of October, I drove out to Route 9 before the diner opened and sat in the parking lot for a few minutes with the engine off. The hand-lettered sign was visible from the lot. Vance's house, in clean dark letters on a white background. Below it, in smaller letters, Community Kitchen and Women's Resource Center. Below that, in Brielle's handwriting, a line she'd added without asking me. Established in memory of Daniel Vance, who always thought this place deserved better. I sat with that for a while. Then I got out of the car, found the key on my ring, and opened the door. Harold was already in the kitchen. Harold is always already in the kitchen. He looked up when I came in, made a face that was his version of a greeting, and said, "Coffee's on. I changed the bean ratio again, and I need you to tell me if it's better. Harold, I've told you 3 times the ratio was fine before. And I've told you 3 times that fine and better are different standards." He slid a mug across the pass-through. "Try it." I tried it. "It's the same," I said. It's marginally better, he said firmly. I took my coffee to the counter and sat down on the end stool while the morning light came through the front windows of the diner my husband had always believed deserved better, and I drank the coffee that Harold insisted was marginally better, and I waited for the day to begin. I was home.